Good morning. Seems this is working today, so I'll go ahead. I'm hopeful that we'll be online. We seem to have good stream health right now, so I will proceed. My name is Skip Conover, and I'm the founder of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. Today I'm going to talk about some of my own dreams and visioning experiences to share with you my personal experiences, and in so doing I'll reveal certain secrets about my life that not everybody knows. And but before I begin, I'd like to ask you, if you're watching this video, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and also mention it in your social networking. You can share under the video, and that will help me. And in the process, I hope to help you. In the chats, you can put some of your own experiences if you like, and in the comments after the video is on playback, and I will do my best to respond to your comments. Let me just get that off my screen. Okay, so one of the issues that comes up is having visions, and I had a long series of visions back in 1993. They lasted for 8 months, and I really didn't, I'm a lawyer, I was a businessman for many years, and I was never trained in psychology, so I never knew what these experiences were like, and they caused me to really wonder about what's going on in my life. And what I've learned from Jungian psychology since that time is that when you study archetypal things for whatever reason, it can trigger visioning and dreams. And that's not necessarily bad, but it is something that you need to be aware of, because it can be quite powerful. And these dreams and visions typically come from what Dr. Jung called our 2 million year old man. And it's actually a 3.5 billion year old man, because it represents the development of our psyche from the first living organisms from which we are descended. And the way our psyche communicates with us is in images. And so you can imagine creatures in the primeval plains of Africa, if they got a vision of a lion, perhaps they realized that meant there was a predator around, so they would be especially worried about that. Or if they had a vision of a snake, perhaps. And this is why snakes come up very often in early cosmological stories, because people have those experiences. And so and they come up to even though you may not consciously realize it, they come up in various ways in society, and once we know what they are, we can recognize them. And so I'm not sure I'm going to talk about transformations through life today, but I did want to talk about some specific visioning that happened to me. And so the reason I have this book title on the screen right now is because in 1993 I wrote this book under a pen name. And Sean says, He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. Very good. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so we have this 2 million-year-old man in us, as Dr. Jung called it, and it is our instinctual, what we call the self in Jungian psychology. It's the deepest archetype in the unconscious, and it's designed to keep us alive, basically, at the most fundamental level. And so it warns us about predators. It does all kinds of things to warn us. And it's a question of understanding the messages and following its guidance in terms of how we live our lives. And the question is, how do we connect to this in our modern life? As I explained yesterday, Dr. Jung saw God as the unconscious. And the unconscious pushes us in ways, both our personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, how we live our lives in our communities. And it's in control. Actually, it drives us. And so Dr. Jung gave a definition of God, which I read yesterday, but I'll read it again. God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. And so what this can mean is that as long as your life is just going along fine, everything is hunky-dory. But when it's not going along fine, then your unconscious starts to hammer on you to behave differently or do something different. And Dr. Jung called this, the structures of this deep unconscious, the archetypes. And we can think of an archetype as kind of a jukebox phonograph record, but it's a phonograph record that we cannot stop. Okay, in other words, once that record gets constellated, what Dr. Jung called constellated, it will play through to the end, no matter what. And so I guess I should talk about basic ideas of archetypes at work in various stages of life. So I'll cover 4 stages of life for both men and women. And so the first of these stages is child. And let me give an example of that because it's a very powerful archetypal example. Recently, I became aware of a little girl who's 5 years old, and she was having pains in her abdomen. She's 5 years old. She had pains in her abdomen, and she went to her mother and she said, "Mommy, I have to go to the hospital right now." And her mother said that her blood ran cold when she heard that. Now, a 5-year-old child doesn't know enough about medicine to know whether they need to be seen by a doctor or go to the hospital or any other such thing, but she may have had some experiences of going to the doctor and so on. So she has in her mind images of what a doctor is and what a hospital is, but there's no way that she as a child could know whether she needs to go to a hospital. But her self, her 2 million-year-old man in her deep unconscious can know. And so our self will draw on images that it finds in our unconscious, and it will speak, and it will speak bombastically. It says, you have to do this now. And so when this little girl went to her mother and said, Mommy, I have to go to the hospital right now, this was not the ego of this little girl saying this. This was her deep unconscious coming up and saying, something is seriously wrong. We need to go to the hospital. And it grabbed the images that this little girl had developed in her life, but there's no way that the ego of a 5-year-old girl could speak so bombastically to her mother and know that she has to go to the hospital. But in fact, she did need to go to the hospital, and so something was seriously wrong. We still don't know what it was. We know it's not appendicitis, but it's something very important. And so she is having treatment now, but as far as I know, there's still no answer about what caused that or why she's having difficulties. But fortunately, she's getting the modern care that she needs. But that would be an example of an archetypal structure in the deep unconscious coming through and giving a message. And when the mother responded by saying her blood ran cold, that again is the deep unconscious of the mother within the mother archetype, hearing that communication from the 2-million-year-old man, understanding its importance, and deciding that right now I'm going to take my child to the hospital. And again, that probably wasn't her ego. That was the mother's archetypal level kicking in and saying, this is important, we have to do this now. And so this is how the archetypes can be very valuable to us. But when we have archetypes constellate in us, it can be very difficult, and it can raise all kinds of issues. And so what I thought I would do today is talk about some of my personal experiences and how they came up, and also why I personally love Dr. Jung's Red Book very much, and so that I can somehow prepare you in case these things happen to you. Because when you study the archetypes, they can get cooking in your unconscious, and it's a good idea to know what they are. Okay, so I had been studying Jungian psychology for about 6 years. In 1993, I had read Man and His Symbols. I was very interested in it. And in 1993, my mother gave this book to my wife for Christmas, Women Who Run with the Wolves, by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And Dr. Estes is a Jungian analyst, a very famous one who works in Colorado. And she calls herself a storyteller. And storytelling is how we teach young people about things. And I want to remind myself to talk about vampires. Okay, that's an interesting sidelight. Okay, so my wife received this book for Christmas. It was a bestseller for about 2 years in the early 1990s. And I picked it up and started to read it, and I wouldn't give it to my wife. I wouldn't let her look at it for 2 days. I read the entire thing cover to cover, and I was just totally taken by this book because it's filled with archetypal stories and archetypal images. And So one of the stories that's in this book is a story that begins on page 74 of the hardbound copy, and it's called Vasilisa the Wise, the Doll in Her Pocket. And Dr. Estes tells us that this story is about how women develop their intuition. And after the story, she provided a 34-page dissertation on the 9 steps that a woman goes through in terms of their individuation. Okay, so fast forward that to a little later in the year now, and we had this war parade, which I was very upset about because Norman Schwarzkopf came back from the Middle East after Gulf War I, and the president allowed him to hold a parade through the streets of Washington, D.C. And even though I'm a retired Marine officer, I do not think it's appropriate to aggrandize our military. Sometimes we have to have our military, and sometimes there are wars that we can't avoid. But if we aggrandize our military, then we take the risk of causing things to happen in our society that we wouldn't want to happen. But you can imagine, if you think about the 20th century, you can imagine what the types of things I'm talking about. And you can imagine it in terms of our more recent wars. And so I was very upset about this war parade. And even though I was living in Washington, D.C., at the time, I decided that I would not watch this war parade. And so instead, I went for a walk. And I was in a transitional midlife crisis kind of time in my life. I was 40 years old. Well, let's see. I was 47 years old, and I was unemployed. And the midlife crisis aspect of that was very painful for me emotionally, obviously. And my wife was traveling out of the country. She and I did a lot of international travel in our business careers. And so she happened to be traveling. And I decided to go for a walk rather than be tempted to turn on the television and watch this war parade. And I decided to think about what I wanted to be in life for the rest of my life. And as I was walking, I thought, well, maybe I should become a writer. And by that, I meant a fiction-style writer. And then it occurred to me that I'd really been a writer all of my life, because I'd been writing things for other people. And because I'm an attorney, I would be writing briefs and other legal papers, for example. And later on, I was writing business plans and that sort of thing once I went into business. And so I'd really always been a writer, but I wanted to be a writer of a novel. I thought about that. And so at the time, just about that time, there was an editorial or an interview in the Wall Street Journal of Michael Crichton, who had just written Jurassic Park, the first volume of his series on dinosaurs coming back to life. And he was asked, what should you do if you're going to write a novel? Because he had written several other successful novels by that time. And he said the answer was to ask a question and then answer it in the course of the novel. And so obviously his question in Jurassic Park was, what happens if dinosaurs could come back to life? What would happen then? And so that was the story that he was telling in Jurassic Park. But so I knew that idea to ask a question. And as I was walking around the U.S. Capitol in the front side of it, where the mall is, and you can look down past the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. And so it was quite a beautiful scene, but it was pretty deserted because this war parade was on. And suddenly it came to my mind that I did have a question, and it was a question that I had had since I was 15 years old. And that was, I had asked my father, we had moved to Japan, we were living in a Japanese house, and we had recently hired a live-in maid. And so I asked my father, how did Michiko, who was then probably 23, I was 15, I asked my father, how is it that Michiko-san comes to a place like our house to work? And his answer was, well, Japanese farm girls typically come to Tokyo to earn their dowry, quote unquote, earn their dowry. Now, at 15, I had no clue what that might mean. And so that question was percolating in my head for 31 years, okay, from 1962 to 1993. It was a question that was in my unconscious and that I didn't feel was adequately answered. And so as I was on this walk, that question came to my mind for whatever reason. I don't know why it came to mind at that time. Maybe I was thinking about the cherry blossoms that are often in Washington and so on. And so then I asked myself, well, what would happen if that young woman, a young woman like that, were to come to Tokyo to earn her dowry, whatever that meant, and ultimately rise to be the first prime minister of Japan? And what would her life be like from age 15 to age 75? And so that's the story, fundamentally. That's the story of this novel. And so at that point, there was nothing going on archetypally. But I started to write some pieces of this novel, some workup in it. And suddenly at about the second day, I was awakened at 6 a.m. by an entity, an entity that I could vision. And it was a young Japanese woman. She was wearing a kimono, much as you see in this image next to me. And she woke me up and clearly let it be known that she wanted me to tell her story. Now, there's a little bit of a follow-on here, which is that 16 years after I graduated from high school in Japan, I went back there and I managed a business there for 5 years. And when I did that, I had a lot of experience with adult Japanese life in many different ways. And so I knew that that I had enough experience with Japanese society and with how people live their lives in modern Japan so that I could be quite detailed in terms of that experience, but applied to this fictitious character. But this vision, who I call Meiko, woke me up at 6 a.m. and wanted me to write her story, wanted to tell her story. And so the way this would happen is every morning at 6 a.m., she would wake me up. I would go to my computer and I would turn the screen down as low as I possibly could so I wouldn't come out of my unconscious. I wouldn't come out of my dream state as much as possible. So I had a very low luminosity on my screen. I would put my hands on the keyboard and then the story wrote itself. I have no conscious recollection of physically putting my fingers on the keyboard after that. The story, I visioned the story, the entire story came out of my unconscious, and I have no real recollection of writing it, except that I know that this process was going on, where every morning this vision would wake me up and make me go to my computer and write 500 to 1,000 words until I got that piece of the story out, and then I could go on with my day. And so obviously that was an archetypal image. I've thought about it a lot over the years, and I know that this was an Anima figure, and I also know that that story came from my deep unconscious. But there was a problem with it. What I thought was happening was that I was writing a novel that maybe I could publish, and so that had been the objective as I was walking around the Washington Monument. But parts of this story came out, and they, to use the euphemism, they contained erotica. And I now know that those materials that were coming out were shadow materials. But at the time, I had no idea what it was. And I was just putting it down. It was coming from my unconscious, just flowing out. And so at the end of the process, finally, when the novel finished, and I thought just that, okay, I was having an experience like any novelist, and that, oh, this must be the way famous novelists write their stories. They get connected with something deep inside. And so if they have writer's block, it represents a disconnection from that deep unconscious place from which excellent novels, top-notch novels, can be written. And I still think that that's right. And so it's a flow that I was having through the writing of this novel. But it lasted 8 months. And it didn't end until the full story was told, until I had Mako at age 75. And she was by then retired from being the first woman prime minister of Japan, which to this day, of course, has not happened in the physical world. And so I had this novel, and my wife, who is a very wise woman, refused to read my novel or any part of it until I had had 10 other women read it. And that was wise in the sense that if your spouse reads something you're writing or criticizes something you're painting or whatever, then that can knock you off track. And so it's better if you don't allow a spouse to criticize while you're doing something creative, whatever it is, unless you're collaborating with your spouse. You might be doing that. But my wife was wise, and she didn't read the book until I had 10 other women read it. And fortunately, at the time, I had a lot of women in the organization that I was running, and so I was able to do that. And what I found rather to my surprise, is that every woman who read it, and at this point there are hundreds, but at that point I didn't know what was going on, every woman that read it and responded to me about it loved it. Okay, absolutely loved this novel. And so the question can be, how did a adult American male write a memoir of a Japanese female woman? And what I had done was I had gone back to Dr. Estes's 9 steps of the development of women's intuition, and I had applied that basic structure to my patina of the Japanese environment. And so that's how it came out. It came out archetypally, and it came out as a complete story. And once the story was told, it was over. Okay. But archetypes work that way. Archetypes, once they're constellated, once they start to play through, they play through to the end. Okay. So I talked about a child, and children aren't necessarily connected at the archetypal level, except for the example I gave earlier in this talk. But they're learning out how to be a human being. A child is, let's say, a wild human being, okay, that has it's pure instinct and no civilization. And so growing up is about learning what the rules are to live in civilization. So the next step that typically occurs in women is the Aphrodite archetype. And that is where women become very concerned about being beautiful, and it all relates to attracting a mate. And at the archetypal level, that's the purpose of it. And so we have many images through mythology of this beautiful Aphrodite walking out of the sea, and with sea foam around her and so on. And, you know, that's where love at first sight comes from too. And so a young woman will learn how to be beautiful and how to attract a mate. And the next stage of life for a woman typically is motherhood. And so the Aphrodite process will continue on until she becomes a mother. Okay, and once she becomes a mother, then the mother archetype plays through. And any women that are watching this will know that once you become a mother, you're a mother for life. And the instinctual activities of motherhood are unstoppable. That archetype, that mother archetype, plays through. And it will play through to old age. And for example, my mother-in-law is a classic mother archetype. She's gone all the way through her life. She's now 88 years old, and she's still quite motherly. But she's also wise. So after one passes the childbearing age, then women tend to go into the wise woman stage. And at each stage, of course, there's both good and bad. Okay, so there are good mothers and there are bad mothers. There are good Aphrodites, and there are bad Salomes who get people's heads cut off. But those are all archetypes. So at this fourth stage, and I'm only talking about very gross stages of human development, a woman will come into the wise woman stage. And so some women are very wise, and they're a gift to the community. And the opposite side of that is obviously women who get branded as witches. Okay, and and but all women can be on either side at some point or other, depending on what's pushing her buttons at the same time. For men, it's very similar, except it's also different. Okay, in in men, again, you're going through this childhood stage, but then the first major archetype that constellates is the warrior archetype. And what that means is the man has to prove himself that he's a man, okay? And so if you think of the Maasai in the Maasai tribe in Africa, at age 12 or so, they would have the young boys stand out in front of the village with only a spear and wait for a lion to attack, and let that boy experience the fear of the lion attack and the experience of how he survived or not, okay? And so that's a very dramatic example. But in my case, I was learning throughout my childhood about the military, but ultimately I had to go and experience being in the military. And so that was the warrior archetype kicking in. And so I remember when I joined the Marine Corps, there was this photograph of a second lieutenant aiming a rifle down the rifle range. And, you know, he had his little gold bar for his rank, second lieutenant, on his hat, and that image actually drove me through my senior year and through getting myself into the Marine Corps in the first place. And then when I went to officer candidate school, in the fourth week, I went and ordered dress uniforms. It was a 10-week program, and I was in the fourth week, and I ordered my dress uniforms. And the reason was that then, although I didn't consciously know this at the time, the vision of being able to wear that uniform was what got me through the trials of making it as a U.S. Marine. And during my senior year, I had a big poster of a second lieutenant who's just been commissioned, and he's wearing his dress white uniform and is very handsome, of course. And so that's the vision of warrior that one gets. But then when you actually go to war and actually are a warrior, something very different happens. And you actually experience what it means to be a warrior. And assuming you survive, you come back knowing what it means, really. I mean, it's not all tea and Skittles, as you can imagine. And so if your father, let's say, was in the military, he probably didn't say much after he came back from being in battle, because he knew what it meant, and he knows what it means. And so men typically can talk among themselves about their experience of playing out this warrior archetype, but they don't usually share it very easily with other members of the family. And so why did dear old dad not talk about the war? Well, this is why. And so it's one of these been there, done that things where you don't want to go revisit those parts of your life. And so the next stage is you're coming out of that, and the next stage is to assume a role as a father and a mature member of a community. And so that is the king stage, and motherhood is typically the queen stage of your maturing and transformation. And so you need to assume, as a man, you need to assume a role in society and take that role on. Then in later life, you become a quote-unquote wise old man, and that's kind of the Gandalf, the Gandalf archetype, the wise man archetype. And so I don't know if I'm wise, but anyway, there's several of you listening right now. So you're hearing my experiences, and by hearing my experiences, maybe you can become wise. I don't know. And so in the case of Mako, however, obviously a man doesn't typically go through the stages that Dr. Estes is talking about, but by using her template, which runs for 34 pages, from page 80 to page 114 of this book, I could understand what the typical experiences of a woman would be, and that allowed me to create this memoir of a woman based on my own archetypal experiences in Japan and so on. And so the point is that when I read this book, it started an archetypal process going in my unconscious. It played out as this novel, and when it completed, I didn't know what to do with it, because it did contain these passages that involve erotica. And so I put it in my drawer for 21 years because I was in the middle of a business career. I went on after that to found a company that became a public company, and playing the role of a novelist and playing the role of a businessman don't really mix. And so I put that novel away, but I promised myself that at the end of my business career, I would publish it. And so I did put it on Amazon in Kindle form in 2014. But the reason that I loved the Red Book, because I still didn't know what was going on in my psyche. And one of the significant things about the Red Book is it told me that Dr. Jung had had visioning experiences like mine. Not the same as mine, obviously, but he too had had visioning experiences. Now, he had an advantage. He was a practicing psychiatrist with a lot of experience, about 15 years experience working with truly mentally ill psychotics. And so he knew something about what happens in the psyche of people who are truly and profoundly mentally ill. And so he knew something about what was happening in his psyche. But when I was in this experience, I didn't know. And what I knew was I was being driven to put this novel down. And as I said, I didn't consciously work it out. I never wrote an outline of my novel or any other such thing. I didn't take a logos approach to it at all. I just put my hands on the keys and it wrote itself. And it was entirely a visioning experience. Now, years later, I know that to be the autobiography of my Anima for that period of time, from 1962 to 1993, when the novel was completed. And everything in that novel is true. It's either true physically, in other words, it's something that happened to me physically, or it's true psychically, it's a psychic fact that happened to me in my psyche. But either way, it's true. So even though it's a fiction, and it's a novel, it's a fictitious novel, it contains many elements of truth, which all novels do, because otherwise you couldn't relate to them. And it also contains psychic facts that were going on in my mind over the years. So when I got the Red Book, and here's the reader's edition of the Red Book, I realized that Dr. Jung, who I had been studying for a long time, had visioning experiences very much like that. And so it helped me realize that I wasn't losing my mind. And apparently, Dr. Jung, some say that he thought he might be having psychosis or a psychotic event at the time. And when at the beginning of the Red Book is when Dr. Jung discovers the collective unconscious, and he had 5 dreams or visions during the period between October of 1913 and August of 1914. He had 5 visions, and those 5 visions were involved the destruction of Europe, okay, in a very shocking way for him. And he had this vision, these visions 5 different times. And so he said he was on August the 1st, 1914, he was in Aberdeen, Scotland, giving a talk. At that point, he would have been 39 years old, and he was giving a talk about psychology, which he and Dr. Freud had been developing for, by then, 15 years nearly. And he said on that day, when war broke out in World War I, he was the happiest man on earth, because at that moment, he knew that he was not psychotic, that he was experiencing the collective unconscious directly. And so obviously the war that broke out and killed 8 million young men, it devastated a whole generation of especially British and German young men, but we lost about 200,000 Americans, I believe, at that time. That war was actually in the collective unconscious. And the point that Dr. Edinger made later is that events like that are psychic epidemics that somehow pass between us unconsciously and cause something as awful as World War I. And it continued to play through World War II, as a matter of fact. But my point is that Dr. Jung started to then have these visioning experiences, and at that point, as of August 1, 1914, when World War I broke out, he realized that he had been having a collective experience, the collective experience, and that it therefore was not, those 5 visions had not been psychotic experiences. And so that helped him very much. And then he continued through a process which he called active imagination to have further visions for the next 5 years. And those 5 years of visions turned out to be the raw material for everything that he later wrote. Okay, so So let me describe for you a couple of visions that came to me in church. Okay, now I was brought up as a sort of plain vanilla Christian because in the days that I was growing up, Christianity, Protestant Christianity in the military was a plain vanilla Christianity. It was not a evangelical Christianity. Unfortunately, the evangelicals have largely taken over major parts of the chaplain corps in the military today. But in those days, it was just a Protestant service. And so I was brought up in Christianity in that way. And my parents later found that that the type of Christianity that best matched that when you're not near a military base was being Presbyterian or Reformed. And Reformed happens to be the church that Dr. Jung was brought up in, and it's the church that Paul Vanderklay grew up in. But anyway, like Dr. Jung said that when he was confirmed by his father, he was confirmed by his own father, who was a Reformed minister, nothing happened. He didn't find any magic, no numinous magic. And by numinous, I mean something that can seem almost magical, okay? And it often comes through the unconscious. But like Dr. Jung, I felt no numinosity at the time that I was confirmed. And basically, I never have had a numinous church because of a religious service. However, I have had 3 numinous experiences in church, 2 of them at the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel and 1 at a Presbyterian church where I grew up, or which was close to my family through my whole life so far. And one of those was when we were baptizing one of my grandsons by my first daughter in that church. And if I start to get emotional, you know that I'm touching something that's a complex within my psyche, and it also has numinosity. So I could feel myself getting emotional as I start to tell this story. So I want to prepare you for that. So in any case, on that particular occasion, after the baptism, the pastor hands my grandson to me, and I'm to carry him around and introduce him to the members of the congregation. And what happened at that time was that I had a sense of a very luminous light coming onto the faces of the members of the congregation as they looked at my grandson. And the church is sort of semi-gloomy. It's a big church with a high ceiling, and so the light isn't terribly good in there, especially because the windows are stained glass, and so they don't allow lots of light in. But the faces of these congregants lit up like a spotlight when that happened. And so that was quite a numinous experience for me. And that was the only experience I ever had in church that could be called archetypal or numinous in Dr. Jung's words, but it was quite moving to me, and it still sticks to my memory very high. And when you remember things for many years, okay, they probably have a certain numinosity to them. And so they probably come in some way from this deep unconscious. So the other two times occurred at the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel. I'm going to take Mako off the screen at this point because this isn't about Mako. But I think one of these experiences I have. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So sometimes when I'm very depressed, I have gone to the U.S. Naval Academy Chapel, which I find quite soothing for various reasons. I don't know why. But when I do that, I'm often the only one in the cathedral. And it seats 2,000 when it's filled. And so on this particular occasion, and many of you may have seen this before, on this particular occasion, I was very down. I had been fighting a lawsuit for many years, and I had filed some papers that day, and I just wanted to rest my mind after that experience. And so I sat down in the chapel on the side looking at a stained glass window that was done by Tiffany, and it's quite a beautiful window. And when, so I was sitting there just in semi-prayer, I would say, and suddenly I was lit up, and I was so taken by it that I said, wow, this is amazing, and nobody's ever going to believe this, so I had better take a photo of it. So I took out my cell phone, believe it or not, and I took this photo. And so in this photo, you can see that the chapel is quite dark. I'm basically seeing the stained glass window that Tiffany made. You can see the very, very bright light coming in on me. And you can also see, as it happens, just for interest's sake, you can see the difference in quality between the three Tiffany windows, which are the top ones, which include a mandala, a sun mandala at the top of it. That's the Tiffany windows. But underneath, there are three smaller stained glass windows. And so you can literally see the difference in quality between the two windows. And so if you hear of Tiffany as a remarkable individual, that's why. And so then I turned but you can see that I was in the dark chapel and this light was on me. And so then I turned it around and took this selfie. And again, you can see that the light is only on me and that the chapel is quite dark around me. And various people over the years have asked me whether this is a gargoyle or something behind me. And actually that's over my right shoulder is the seal of the Naval Academy. But because it was quite dark in the room, and you can see right next to it one of the stained glass windows on the other side of the building, which wasn't lit up, you can see just how dark it was and how remarkable it was that I was lit up. Now, this we would call a synchronicity, okay? And you can say what you want about synchronicities. It doesn't necessarily move you the way it moved me. But as you saw from the selfie that I took, it completely changed my attitude and my demeanor about my life. And so that was quite a numinous experience, and an experience that powered me at a very, very deep level. And I'm just giving you an example of this. William James wrote a book at the end of the 19th century called Varieties of Religious Experience. And in that, he describes what numinous experiences are like. And so I'm only trying to give you an example of what a numinous experience was like in my life. And then you can think of it as you may, but you may have had experiences like that as well. And the other occasion at the Naval Academy Chapel, again, I was in the chapel to gather my thoughts and get over a stressful time. And if I recall correctly, I was sort of leaning forward in an attitude of prayer. And one of the things about what I was doing in my lawsuit was standing, in my mind, standing against domestic enemies. Okay, so when one joins the service or any government service, you swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States and to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it was my perception that I was standing against domestic enemies, people who were denying the rule of law to average citizens, which I still think was happening. But I'm not going to get into that at this point. But in any case, it was quite stressful, and myself had forced me to do this work over a 9-year period. It didn't let me stop. And so it was quite difficult. I never really liked the practice of law per se. I liked becoming a lawyer, but I didn't like the practice of law. But here I was forced into what turned out to be a 9-year long litigation. And I had to do it all myself. I didn't have any support of any staff. And so everything that I filed, and I filed over 4,000 pages of material in the local circuit court, everything I filed was written by me personally and typed by me in every respect. And so that was quite a difficult activity. And so on one of these occasions, after I did my filing, I went to the church, or to the cathedral of the Navy, and was contemplating this and contemplating the fact that I felt that I was standing up for the Constitution and the rule of law. And while I was there in that contemplative situation, I had a vision of the 5 men that I know who gave their lives for the Constitution of the United States in military action. 3 of them in Vietnam, 1 in Iraq, and 1 in Lebanon. 5 men I personally know who died protecting our country. And I had the vision of each of these 5 men coming forward from the pulpit toward me putting his hand on my head and in kind of a way of blessing. And so each one gave me this blessing. And as you see, it was quite a numinous experience. It affected me very deeply. And as I remember that numinous experience, it was a very real experience. And so I remember it today just as clearly as any experience I have in the physical world. And of course, it was partially in the physical world. I was physically sitting in the Naval Academy Chapel in the very same pew that you saw earlier. And but the 5 men who gave their lives obviously came from the depths of my psyche. And so you can call it what you will, I don't care, but I consider that quite a religious experience. And so I know that religious experiences can happen. And as many of you probably know, I also had an experience with Mephistopheles when my daughter spent a year and a half in Russia. And while she was in Russia, she was influenced by fundamentalist missionaries, American fundamentalist missionaries, who were the only young people, American young people in this Russian city called Kazan in Tatarstan. And so when she came back, she had been very heavily influenced by this group, and I took her out to dinner, and it happened to be her 22nd birthday, and therefore I know when this happened, which was February the 22nd, 1999, and it was just the two of us. We had a very interesting life together in many ways, because I took her and her sisters and mother to Japan in 1980, and we lived there for 5 years, and beginning when this particular daughter was 3 years old. And we had traveled throughout the world together, never to Russia, though. And so we had a lovely evening. We actually went to an Afghan restaurant in Washington, and it was a lovely evening together, reminiscing about various parts of our lives. But when we parted, she said, "Well, Dad, I'm sorry to say this to you, but I think you're going to hell." And I said to oh my God. And at that moment, I fell into hell, literally, because, and so I'm sure that this is how missionaries and pastors who are fire and brimstone pastors scare people into coming into the Christian church, because I was obviously quite shocked. I said to myself, geez, who teaches a child to say such a thing to their parent? I mean, just ridiculous. And as I was driving home from Washington to my home in Annapolis that evening, as I'm about halfway across on Route 50, traveling at 65 miles an hour, suddenly I had a vision of Mephistopheles plopping down in the seat next to me. And this was Mephistopheles that I had envisioned when I read Faustus in college. And so, thinking fast, I decided to cut the Faustian bargain. So I said, okay, I'll give you my immortal soul on my death, provided that none of my daughters ever think that about me again for the rest of my life. And he disappeared. He was satisfied with that decision. Now, I've been criticized by some of my followers for making such a cheap bargain for my soul. But, you know, at some level, I had had a lot of experience with visions by then. And so I, at some level, although not consciously at that moment, but immediately after, I knew that this had been a psychogenic vision and not a physical reality, that it had come from my psyche. And so that was the right answer, because if you're traveling at 65 miles an hour and the devil sits down next to you, you better think fast about what you're going to do, because I think that, you know, it could easily also result in an accident or something like that. Or it can result in you getting religion because now you know the devil is real. Whatever it is. But anyway, that's my experience. And again, I remember that as if the devil was physically sitting with me in my automobile traveling 65 miles an hour. And so these things can happen. And so I wanted to talk about John Nash. And John Nash was the mathematician who was the basis of the book A Beautiful Mind. And in that movie, he's depicted as having had a number of visions, and unfortunately, that movie, the way they play through the story and cover the story, that movie makes it seem like by taking drugs, he had been able to be cured enough to win the Nobel Prize. But I've read John Nash's own testimony about this experience. I don't mean legal testimony, but I mean his own story about it. And first of all, he said that he did not have visions such as the ones that are described in the movie. And one of the points that was made was that you can hear voices. And the reality is that everybody hears voices. But the trouble is that the American pharmaceutical industry and doctors can convince you that you should be taking a narcotic pharmaceutical because you hear voices. But we all hear voices. Everyone does, because typically that's a communication from yourself to you, suggesting some solution or something about your life that you need to know. And so what's shameful about the movie A Beautiful Mind is that it was used by the pharmaceutical industry as a way to justify drugging people. And when you drug someone in that way, you cut their ego mind, their ego consciousness off from their self. And And the self is the deepest archetype in the unconscious. And the way Dr. Jung put it was that we need a connection with the infinite, okay? And that connection with the infinite is a connection to this 2 million-year-old man, this psyche that's developed in our unconscious since our grandparents were single-celled organisms, because all of us are children of creatures who evolved successfully with successful regeneration in every generation from single-celled organisms to us. Every one of us is the result of that process, every human being. And we're all the result of success in that respect, in that there was successful reproduction into the next generation. And so that unconscious self is what has kept our parents and grandparents going all the way back 3.5 billion years. It's what has kept us alive and all of our ancestors alive, because it's instinct, and that instinct works. Okay, there's one caveat though, and that caveat is the instinct that you have in your psyche is modeled the day of your birth, okay? It hasn't evolved any further since the day of your birth. What has evolved since the day of your birth is your ego. And so, but you do have instinctual reactions that warn you, that tell you something is important. So the example I gave earlier of the 5-year-old girl, that was herself communicating directly with the self of her mother, saying, I need to go to the hospital. Okay, that was an instinctual reaction, but it's coming through the voice and the apparent presence of this 5-year-old girl. But obviously, in terms of her ego development, she wasn't old enough to know that she needed to go to the hospital, but herself knew that something was going wrong in her deep body, in her physical body, and was communicating that to the only person that could help her, which was her mother. And the fact that her mother, her blood ran cold at that moment, that was an instinctual reaction too, because that told her, this is important, I better pay attention to my child. And she took her to the hospital, and we still don't know what the issue was, but and it wasn't appendicitis, which is what many would think, I suppose, but that was a question of this so-called 2-million-year-old, 3.5 billion-year-old man, or psyche, the self, telling the psyche of her mother, who was the only one that could help her, that you have to get this fixed now. And so it did. And so she took her to the hospital. I think she may still be there, but we don't know what the result of that is. But these things happen all the time, and we need to learn to pay attention to them and to understand that, we're not going crazy. It's not psychosis. It's the way our psyche works to keep us alive, and that's what our psyche does. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking for the last hour and a half or so. So I'm going to go back and go through your chats. I appreciate your patience. I hope this has been useful to give you a sense of my personal experiences with dreams and visions, and why it's important to pay attention to visioning. And so, for example, I got this book this week, which is The Art of C.G. Jung. And Dr. Jung, in this are many different examples of visioning coming through Dr. Jung. And so many of these have not been seen before, but some of them do appear in the Red Book. For example, this one, this map of a Chinese city is a mandala, and it was an important mandala that he had prepared and he recognized as a mandala when he communicated in 1928 with Richard Wilhelm about the secret of the golden flower. But there are lots of other very, very powerful and interesting paintings in this book done by Dr. Jung that express an emotion or something at the time. And you may remember in the movie Good Will Hunting, where Robin Williams and Matt Damon are in Robin Williams' office, and they're talking about a painting on the wall, which is a painting of a lifeboat going out over the surf. And Matt Damon gives a very flippant analysis of that painting, and Robin Williams grabs him by the throat and says he better not disrespect his wife. And so you can see that these things can have huge emotion associated with them. I'll just share with you a couple more of these images. This is Faunus, who is a mythological figure, and let's see. It was very interesting to me. I did not know. This is the famous painting of Philemon that Dr. Jung talks about. Philemon was a psychogenic entity that Dr. Jung interacted with during his Red Book period. And Philemon represented his self talking to him. And you can actually see the discussion of the imagery in the Red Book, and particularly if you have the folio version. Unfortunately, you need to spend $150 for the folio version, but this book, which talks about the folio version, is about $50, and so it does have some of the Red Book images in it. For example, this here is an image from the Red Book, and in it you can see also the calligraphy that Dr. Jung did. And you can see that he worked in many different media, so he actually carved these pieces of wood. And of course, on this web channel I used, well, this is interesting too. This is an image which is many different faces, and that Dr. Jung had run into, and it has a different expression. And it apparently, well, it was right at the end of his Red Book period that this came out. And so there's many, many different images in this, and many that have not been seen before. So they're very powerful. I mean, I'll give you a sense. These are mandala images that Dr. Jung did. Okay. And so the point is they're expressing a certain emotion at a given time, and each of them is different, and some of them are quite remarkable. Like the sun actually in the earth in this case. And anyway, this book is called The Art of C.G. Jung, and it's just been published in the last year, and it's very, very valuable. So now I'll go back to your comments here. And Netsko said, I cyclically and verbally defied the goddess, screamed that I wasn't ready for another round, and she broke every avenue I was using to stay unconscious, actually broke stuff. And I believe that. And Estes is the bestest, yes. Nancy Lee says, women who run with the wolves help me incorporate the Baba Yaga energy when needed. And Goddess of Oneness says, I had many deja vu. I had many deja vu going through MEPS when I was going into Navy. Everything about the experience was with synchronicities. It was definitely part of my warrior archetype. And I'm seeing that we don't have good stream health at the moment, although I'm broadcasting good stream health, so I don't know what that is about. And Netsko says, I was trying to reverse map Animus through the copious amounts of information on Anima, and my Jung's book you share through Dropbox was incredibly enlightening. Thank you for sharing. Hunger Stormy says, hopefully I can get a copy of the Red Book here. Natsuko said, I'm primarily visual as well. I'm so curious about others' experiences with self through gustatory olfactory, like Keats talks about in a vision, kinesthetic audio. Does anyone hear? Okay, well, have any personal experiences through those representational systems? I think my basic way of being in the world is kinesthetic, actually, not visual, although, and I'm quite introverted, so I'm working with things in my deep unconscious. And because I was raised in the U.S. military, we changed places of living very often, and so my whole world would be turned topsy-turvy every year or two. And I do remember being very quiet, sitting in the back seat of the car on long car trips that took in those days 10 days, because we would drive across the United States and we would average about 300 miles a day before interstates. And so I was alone in the back seat contemplating what was going by me and how I was feeling all of those times. And of course, those generated in me the fact of being introverted, which I now find ways to push past by being involved in this website and so on. But I still am quite introverted, and so when I go to a party, I'm always much happier sitting in the corner talking to one person and not in the center of the room yucking it up and telling jokes, which extroverted people are comfortable with. I think people who are auditory tend to process their emotions through music, and to a certain extent, I have done that, especially with classical music. I've done that, and I have enjoyed going to concerts where I literally have visioning experiences being at concerts. I mean, I remember one particularly when I was in about the 11th grade, when our school took us to an NHK concert at the music hall at Ueno in Tokyo. And so the NHK orchestra is one of the leading orchestras of the world. And I remember hearing the Pastoral Symphony by Beethoven. And I remember specifically visioning the pastoral scenes while I was listening to that music, and I could close my eyes and see those scenes, but the outside stimulus was the music, not anything visual except for the musicians playing on the stage. So that would be an example, I suppose. And Nancy Lee says, when you ended the experiences with Mako, how did you do that? Did she keep pestering you? No, she didn't. I told her story, and when I was finished telling her story, it was over. Okay, the archetype played through. So as I said, these archetypes, once they get constellated, they're not going to stop until they're finished. Okay, you are like a jukebox. Okay, and you have this jukebox full of archetypes that can get somebody can put in a nickel, and all of a sudden that archetype's going to come out and it's going to play. But once it starts playing, it's not going to stop until it's done. And so, for women, motherhood is the most powerful archetype. But the archetype of Aphrodite stops when a mate is encountered and you become a mother. Once you become a mother, then the Aphrodite archetype goes into goes back in the jukebox, and maybe it still tries to play a little bit over the years, but maybe it doesn't. I don't know why we're getting this flickering on the screen. So anyway, in the case of Mako, once I had told her story, which included her becoming prime minister and included her getting into old age, then she didn't come back. I mean, I remember her and I remember the experience, but she didn't come back and pester me. And that says, yes, my last vision was in my best friend's solo violin concert. So beautiful. It helps that she's a shameless shamaness. It helps that she's a shamaness, yeah. And so people who are sensitive to these things, do know how to constellate them, but also how to work with them. And so it's obviously quite complicated. Dr. Jung wrote for 60 years about this. And so my reason for telling these stories today is to make them the experiences available so that others can see that their experiences are not craziness, but they're a normal part of the way we operate as human beings. So I hope that's helpful. And I hope this video makes it to the playback, because again, I'm having difficulties with YouTube, so I'm going to have to look into different broadcast software and see if that makes a difference. So I'm going to discontinue at this point and wish you a good weekend, and I hope this has been helpful to you. If you're interested in our Dropbox and you're not a member, please write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to add you to that. I'm going to put the that's my email address, and I need your email address in order to add you to the Dropbox. So if you wish to be added, please feel free to write to me, and I'll add you. If you're interested in being interviewed or talking in a general way, I'm not a mental health professional, but if you're interested in talking to a sympathetic soul, you're welcome to contact me about being interviewed and to share your experiences on this channel, which would be appreciated, I think, by many. And so thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.